Of course, the day to pick is one when every breath is a lover's rotten heat too close to my face and the ground hums. I scale the rocky lakebed of this upturned country to the nave of where I go to worship red. The plump, fresh flexes pleasantly as damper petals on a great organ, and I kneel as close as I dare to hear their tracheal song. From the safety of the berry beds, I am a pilgrim. Heat leaches purpose from my conscious mind. This must be the clarity or delusion of history making fools of so many. In the telephone interview he did from inside a federal prison, when he laughed. The lilting tone reminded me of my father explaining how to marshal cherry tomatoes in the side yard bed, rising like the disadvantaged against the whitewashed house. Each of us is given a curse we carry around in our pockets, hopeful scratches on tiny handwritten slips, washed many times and linted. The tragedy of our historical nothingness weighs on everyone, and I breathe the uneasy, moonlit sonata's first movement in C sharp minor. Picking Strawberries at Living Hope Farm, a poem by Liz Chang from her collection of poems, Animal Nocturnal. So, good evening. My name is Charles Carr, and welcome to Philly Loves Poetry, a collaboration between the Moonstone Art Center of Philadelphia and PhillyCam. The focus of our program is to give our audience the experience of the rich culture of poetry in the city of Philadelphia and the surrounding areas. So tonight as we have had so many times this year, a really remarkable poet who's well known and very much beloved, Liz Chang. Liz was the 2012 Montgomery Poet Laureate in Pennsylvania. Liz's poems have appeared in Verse Daily, Exit 7, Breakwater Review, and Stone Boot Literary Journal, among others. Liz's fourth collection, a chapbook called Museum of Things, is available now from Finishing Line Press. Liz's translation of Claude de Bourrienne's poetry is anthologized in Paris in Our View from l'Association d'Amis de Shakespeare and Company. Liz is visiting assistant professor of creative writing at Moravian University. So, welcome, Liz. It's really great to finally have you on our program here. So, I wanted to start our discussion tonight based on a line from a poem. Just one line I saw from a poem by K.B. Brookins on the back of Poetry, the issue in March. And the, the line reads, "Before I was a poet, I was a lineage." And it's from his poems or his poem, Notes After Watching the Inauguration. And after reading your books of poems, especially Museum of Things, I thought of you when I read this quote and how this line might have been yours. And I thought of you and how this line really not defines, but has very much to do with my consciousness of what you do with your poetry. So I wonder if you could respond to that, to that opening and to that very small little line.
Well, thank you, Charles, for having me and also for possibly giving me that line. I wish it were mine, right? Um, you and I have kind of spoken elsewhere that I actually come from the visual arts first. That's what I studied as an undergrad. And so I'm reminded of the story about Pablo Picasso, who somebody handed him like a bar napkin one time when they were out, and he like scribbled something on it. and he handed it back and he said, that'll be $10,000, please, or some sort of astronomical thing. And they said, well, that took you 3 seconds. And he said, 60 years and 3 seconds. And so I really believe, I think I have to on some level, because my life has kind of taken a bit of a wandering path, that everything that we do along the way kind of leads up to this moment. And in particular, I've been writing more recently about kind of my family and my family history. And so I extend that even further back, not just in my life, but every moment that's kind of come before me leading up to this moment, and the creation of the poems that I've been fortunate enough to kind of put out into the world and share.
Yeah, and the introduction to your book of poems, Providence, and you have an introduction, and I saw this, and it says, my poetry tends to focus on my identity as a woman, as a biracial individual whose appearance is often interpreted as subscription to a culture she knows nothing about, and frequently not even the one from which she has descended. And it's interesting. That was an introduction to a book in 2007. So now we're up to 2023, and and you have written a lot in between. But I still see, there's the relevance of that remark. And of course, the other thing that is so prominent in your poetry, and which I find very fascinating. And in fact, I had another poet on last month. We all also explored this, this focus, and that's the focus on things, on objects, and how evocative and how provocative the smallest of objects can be in invoking, uh, you know, observation, but so many emotions in us and so many memories. And also with you, and especially in the Museum of Things, there's this opening uh, to the history of your family, the history of you, that it is like a museum definitely a museum as you read this book.
Yeah, well, to be truthful, those poems originally began kind of bursting forth when I was locked down in my house. And so I was, as you may notice behind me, I'm kind of in amongst the Museum of Things.
Uh-huh.
But if I had to kind of trace the psychology back, I would say that in a lot of ways, I'm kind of the keeper of the stuff in my family. Um, a few months ago, there was an op-ed that ran in the New York Times. I think the author's name was Rob Walker, but don't quote me. It was called Clutter is Good. And it's kind of this pushback against the idea of minimalism, and Marie Kondo, which, I think of as being very well-intentioned. But and obviously when we're talking about just like buying for buying's sake, there's a consumerist aspect. But apparently what I do is this thing called instrumental materialism, which is where I look at objects and kind of see the story behind them. I see the person who gave it to me, the circumstances, and it's kind of like all encompassing for me. So as an extension of that, it's very hard for me to get rid of things. And if I wonder a little bit if it is my family story, which is an immigrant story, right? This idea of kind of having to leave everything behind, and maybe a reaction to that. Um, but as well, just being very influenced by past generations, and my grandparents coming of age during the Depression, etc. I've always been someone who hangs on to things.
Right, right. But this especially, I mean, the objects that you present in this wonderful book. I mean, it's very interesting that you give, it's almost like going to an auction, right? Where you give the minute details in terms of size and scale, even I guess who made these things, and just briefly that they're part of of a family collection in some cases, and then it proceeds from here. For example, just open it to one thing: the time has come the goddess said to talk of many things. And it's actually uh, two objects, that you're talking about here. And it very much, opens up to so much. Uh, so where does this come from? I mean, where does this inspiration come from? Is it something that's always been kind of a focus of your? Because I see objects and other things in your other books, but they're not. And of course, you have one collection that is actually called "What Ordinary Objects," and of course, you also have those poems in translation. But
Mhm.
uh, once again, this ordinary objects, where does that come from? And is there another inspiration within poetry, either from another poet? You talked about being a visual artist
Right.
and how that all has come together, and how you want to take it forward in your other
Mhm.
work.
Well, again, I would say that a lot of it does come from kind of being visually oriented in the world, which, of course, comes from having studied visual art first. I do tend to really love the work that I read that kind of centers on this idea of objects as a jumping off point for the story. And I think, in particular, the poem that you highlighted, the idea of the coming together of objects, in that case, I have a statue of a goddess that my grandmother gave to me when she was kind of losing her touch with reality. Um, she suffered from vascular dementia late in her life, so she kind of had constant small strokes. And so she gave me an explanation for where it came from, but I wasn't sure that that was the whole story. So I had to do a little bit of research to figure out that side of me. And then also, I happened to find a wedding gift that my parents received. And the kind of complexity of their wedding day was that my mother's family disowned her and sent all of her stuff COD the day of her wedding, for marrying a man who was Chinese from Hawaii. So there is this perhaps generational wanting to speak, I suppose, for the generations that have come before, and to kind of put it together in a way that we can step back from it, almost like one would inside of a museum or a gallery, and kind of examine it for both its kind of human moments and the pain that is tied to those times that my family has endured.
Mhm, mhm. And also, there were in one of your books, you had this very tender, and I think it was might be the last poem, a very tender conversation with your daughter about this issue of who you are.
Yes.
And you also indicated to me that recently you've even used that as a focus in your as a professor with your students.
Mhm.
Can you talk about that?
Yeah. Well, again, one of the things I kind of had to confront, and I tried to avoid it for a very long time, and I that's the way in which it came up with my students. This idea of the subjects that you want to move the furthest away from are probably the ones that you should lean into. um, and this idea of, again, identity. On the one hand, I've had the luxury, and you kind of heard that a little bit in the intro part that you read out from 2007, which is, again, going way back into the archive. Um, this idea of having this kind of dual identity. I am half Chinese by background, but I happen to look a lot more like my dad. And even if you were to look at my sister and I, who come from the same combination, my sister looks a lot less of the Asian side.
Mhm,
When I would go places with my mom, they wouldn't even think that we were part of the same family, things like that.
mhm,
And so, not looking like every part of my family for my whole life was something that I really had to kind of think through and grapple with as I started my own family. And so I was thinking in particular about those messages and experiences that I wanted to pass along as I now have two little girls, to my children as they grew up. This idea of kind of existing in the world as someone who has a multiracial background, and whose initial kind of impression maybe doesn't tell the whole story, which, whose initial impression does, right? But kind of the things that I've learned from that. And in fact, one of the poems that I'm going to be reading later does, in fact, kind of marinate in those feelings, and the ways in which my daughter has had to confront them as well, even though she's just barely 8.
Hmm. Considering, is there more of an urgency now in the society that we live in, uh, that you feel much more of a responsibility as an artist to, you know, to define your work and include in your work, this message? And it's like something that we in this society cannot walk away from anymore. And so, do you feel that responsibility around that?
Definitely. Can you? I've been nodding since you started asking this question.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. And again, I would say that this is something that I've kind of come to as I've grown up. Again, coming from the art world, I've always thought of the most powerful art as kind of speaking of the conscience of society. And I've always kind of aspired to, I'll put this in quotes, like write political poetry, but I don't know that I've ever done it successfully when I sat down and said, I'm going to write a political poem. And in some ways, I think you've hit upon my kind of cheat, which is that I start in an object and I kind of move towards the thing that I want to express, which again, today is so much more powerful. I think the history of Asian Americans in this country has been one of kind of staying small in a lot of ways. And perhaps that has been the burden of the myth of the model minority. And in some ways, again, in the last few years, there's been this ratcheting up of visibility of the Asian American experience, and kind of sometimes for worse, right? Targets of violence, for instance.
Hmm.
But I also think that it's a really important moment in our history and kind of an opportunity to maybe redefine our place in, because we've been here for a very long time. And in fact,
Yeah.
my family has been here in particular for a very long time. So it, kind of reshape what that might look like. And again, I think my aim in sharing my story has been to kind of carve out a space for myself and my family in just one corner of the world. And if that helps somebody else figure out their space, that's a wonderful thing.
Hmm. Yeah. Someone said, in a workshop, and it might have been Leonard Gontarek, who said all poems are political. Uh, and really, my poems, I say a lot of them are political, and sometimes I don't even realize they're political. And I see that in yours. As somebody would say, well, no, but I see the political without it being forcefully political,
Right.
and which really measures up that to that description. All poems are political in some way, some more so than others. I also wanted to talk to you about you as an artist, because you have the background and training of more than just writing, the visual arts, and uh, how you bring that all together. What is your discipline, and what is your practice in poetry? I mean, some poets say, well, I get up at 5:30 every morning, have my coffee, and bang, I go at it for 3 hours or whatever, and I give it a shot, and I might, get 3 lines of poetry. Maybe I'll write a whole poem, maybe I'll write 5 poems. I don't know. I'm not saying about me, but I've heard that different poets, so they have that discipline. How do you define your discipline as a poet?
Well, it is one of those things. At the beginning of every semester, I ask my students like what their goals are for the semester, for their semester in my class. And that's always the thing that I say is a goal for myself as a writer, is to improve my discipline. So you hit the nail right on the head there. I would say that Since after graduate school, and before I became a parent, I had like a time in the week, every week, that I would sit down to write. It was Thursday mornings, and I would set aside time for myself. And it was only an hour and a half weekly. And that doesn't sound like a lot of time. But that was actual, like, in front of the computer time. And I am somebody who does compose on the computer screen. I know not everybody does. And so one of the things I was trying to tell my students is that even though it's only an hour and a half, right, that I've committed to each week. And even once when my children were small, I had to like set a timer and get my hour and a half in kind of like little fits and starts. I'm finally now back at a place where I can have it on my calendar. I'm still making decisions the rest of the week. I'm thinking about what I'm going to be doing for that hour and a half. I'm kind of like, kind of working on things in the back of my mind, thinking about approaches. I try not to sit down with like a purpose for a poem, but maybe like an avenue in, kind of like a sidewalk into the idea, and then kind of see what happens. And I leave that time and space to be open to things, to kind of experiment. And again, perhaps that's something that comes from, visual art and a visual art tradition. On some level, you kind of like make the sketches beforehand, and you might kind of have some idea of the composition and how it interacts with the frame of what you're working on. But then you get into it and you just kind of see where it goes.
Hmm. Yeah. So yeah, that is very. Are you a prodigious note taker? In other words, before I with my age, I have some of these great ideas at night, right? Unless I write that down in this notebook next to my bed, it just disappears. And I'm thinking of it, and I say, oh, well, I'll remember it, and I don't. I don't even have a clue what was there the night before. So I write a lot of notes, and there's scribbling all over the place, but nonetheless, it is very helpful. Do you have that kind of discipline also, or?
I was going to say, trust me, it's not just you.
Right, right.
I would say I more, and perhaps the people in my life could corroborate this. I am very protective of kind of my time and my mental space. So I take
Um,
notes about absolutely everything else so that
uh,
it doesn't take up space in my brain that should be reserved for poetry and for
uh-huh.
creation. I have a million reminders on my phone and to-do lists everywhere, et cetera, et cetera. I tend not to take notes for poems. And this is just the process that has worked for me up until this point. It could obviously evolve and change. But one of the reasons for that, I think, is because my first semester in graduate school, I studied with Mary Ruffel. And she was the workshop leader with Ralph Angel. And they were an incredible duo. And one of the things Mary said, that I've kind of taken to heart is, try not to sit down with an idea for a poem. If you think you have a good idea for a poem, take a walk.
Mhm.
Take a walk, breathe the fresh air, and then come back and sit down and write it. And on some level, I think what she was trying to tell us was to not have the author's purpose kind of override what the poem can do. And I think sometimes I can be overly ambitious in my poems. I always joke in my workshop group that every poem I write should really be 3 poems. I almost like kind of pile too much on top, um,
Uh-huh.
which again should not be a surprise to anybody if you can see what's happening behind me, right?
Mhm.
And the philosophy that I was speaking to about before. And so on some level, it's more about like clearing the way for me and having the poem happen, than putting too many purposes on it.
Right. That's a great advice. Is
I stole it.
that
So
yeah? Well, walk with it for a while, and then that's and I will. I'm gonna pull that from you. That's going to be good advice that I've learned from Philly Loves Poetry to use it. And you mentioned, two poets that influence. Are there currently poets that you're reading that or have read that you say these are people that give me a lot of inspiration and have given me inspiration in terms of being a poet?
I mean, I am somebody who believes in reading widely, pretty much everything and anything I can get my hands on. Poetry and translation. Obviously, I don't Sometimes people say like you're not reading the original, so it's not the same. And even though as a translator, I realize that I tend to read stuff in translation that is in a written language that I kind of have some understanding of anyway. So I can kind of I really love bilingual editions, and I can look back and forth and think about the decisions that the translator has made. Um, but you know, again, my favorite poets, my influences are kind of always changing for that reason. And
Hmm.
I often tell my students that you can learn as much from poets whose work is like yours than and poets that are writing stuff that's completely unlike yours.
Hmm.
And so I would say the first person that comes to mind who I've been reading recently, partially because I was teaching his work, is Ross Gay. And I absolutely love the work that he is doing right now. And one of the things that I so admire, and I wish I knew his secret, I wish I knew how he was pulling it off, is this idea of writing as a conscience, like I was mentioning before, but also, you know, kind of building a wall against despair. I think he's really wonderful at kind of walking that line and finding the beauty in these moments around us when there's so much to be concerned about in our modern lives.
Hmm. Now, looking forward, I mean, what are you working on now? Do you have like what one calls projects, or you just say, I don't have projects, I just write poetry and poems, and then maybe they might be a project, or maybe they might be a collection. How are you, what quote unquote project oriented, or is it I write poems and once I feel I have a good collection, I show that to my editor, and we'll see how we can, organize it and make it into something. Is that
Well, it's funny. I used to just do the thing that you were talking about, the ladder, right? Where I would just kind of write and see where things took me. Obviously, there are some themes that keep coming up again and again in my work, and so there's hopefully kind of a natural thread that runs through things simply because they were created by me. But I think since having children, I've become much more of a planner in terms of projects. So the Museum of Things, which was the chapbook from Finishing Line, began as just like 3 or 4 what I thought were short flash memoir pieces. And it was actually my poetry friends who told me, no, in fact, these are poems. And then I was moved to kind of write more, enough to be a book. But also tonight I am going to be reading for the first time, so please forgive me. Some things from my next project,
really
which kind of like grabbed
great?
me by the ankle, kicking and screaming while I was ramping up the publicity for Museum of Things. Well, it was already kind of at the publisher, and I had some time and space to step back. My engagement ring was actually on my great 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 grandfather's person when he died the night of the Titanic tragedy. Um,
Oh,
it was sewn into his coat, and he did not survive, but his personal effects were returned, and his wife had received a letter that said, I bought this ring for you. I'm sewing it into my coat because I don't trust the other people on the ship. And so when his coat came back, they found it in the lining of the coat.
wow.
Um, and so that was my third great grandfather on my mother's side. I recently read a Washington Post article, actually in honor of the documentary that came out about the 6 Chinese. There were actually 8 Chinese sailors who were traveling. They were basically commuting on the Titanic in steerage, and 6 of them survived. So the documentary is called The Six.
Oh,
And I was just kind of thinking about how life might have been different if it had been my father's family traveling on that ship instead of my mother's family.
oh, that's fascinating. Well, I'm really anxious to see what comes out. That's fascinating. Absolutely,
Thank
absolutely, really great to hear. So, I mean, we're at that point. I mean, it's great this discussion, but our viewers really want to hear you read your wonderful, wonderful, remarkable poem. So, I'm going to give the screen to you and let you take it from there. And it's been a great discussion, and I thank you very much. Learned a lot from our discussion.
Thank you so much, Charles. And thank you so much for hosting this program, and to Arian behind the scenes and everybody, and the support of Moonstone. It's just absolutely wonderful to have this opportunity in Philadelphia.
Yeah.
Um, So I'll actually start with some work that is kind of coming up from some of the work uh, that is going back into a place of putting together all of this background and kind of scenery on some level. I am working towards having the work speak for itself, right? All of these kind of pieces come together in this moment, and in particular, the details of the date. Today is April 4th, and so it is the 32nd anniversary of a plane crash that happened here in Philadelphia. And I know, Charles, you and I have
Yeah.
a bit of a history with that particular incident. Um, it happened
Right.
at lunchtime at Marion Elementary, and I was a second grader. And fortunately, I was not on the playground, but two first graders who were when this happened passed away. And Senator John Hines, who was in the plane that was flying over the elementary school, also did at the same time. And there was a second grader who was in my class who suffered from burns from this incident. So with that as the jumping off point, I will start with some of those poems. This first one comes from Museum of Things, and it's a lamp, Charlie Brown. And it's a ceramic Snoopy lamp base with plastic nightlight balloons, two missing, strings cut, topped with ivory paper lampshade, printed with pictures of Peanuts characters flying kites. Second generation Chang family collection. 1. My father says, my mother says, we bought it from a store a few doors down from his first office job. I always wondered if it came from my grandparents, who sent Schultz crib sheets from Hawaii, paying whatever astronomical price to ship printed cotton so many miles as a declaration of their wishes for me, that I might always be uncomplicated, docile, faithful. 2. When I arrived, I was none of those things, but I don't remember snubbing Snoopy or his ceramic sidekick as I grew. I do remember gazing at the balloons that never rose, while my mother recounted how my classmate in the hospital might die from third-degree burns, and how I cried and wished aloud that it could have been me instead, feeling grief flow out of me and into the balloon's empty chambers. 3. In seventh grade, Snoopy toppled from my highboy dresser, shattering two of those balloons that had stayed illuminated for so much of my childhood. I recall the sound, a sternum cracking. My father claims he bumped the lamp one night while we were disagreeing, but what echoes inside my head, my fault, my fault, my fault, belies this. All I can remember now is picking up the shards, fallen like so many scattered eggshells. And for tonight, I brought a prop. This is the Unsippy Cup, which is artist unknown, 20th century, frosted plastic child-sized beer stein with Marion School printed in red block letters, second generation Chang family collection. Now my daughter drinks from the cup, the one I won as a door prize at the fair in elementary school. The fair where we threw rings around Coke bottlenecks and sipped lemon juice jammed into the flesh of citrus half-suns through striped sugar straws, pretending we hadn't been marked as no longer children. Just months before, when a plane fell from the sky, the burnt-out husk of a helicopter coiled around it like a flaming nest, and the jet fuel watered our hand-clipped baseball field so that it smelled like heady death for weeks, while we traded stickers in scorched ditches, shallow graves. When I won this cup, I did not blink at its foreign bulk, its adult curves and double bottom, but now I wonder whose catalog ordering pre-internet made all of us 8-year-olds imitation beer garden juicy juice sloshers. Even the sans serif red letters aged us, standing at attention as clear and crisp as any college logo, leaving off the tag of what should have been elementary, my darling. But this is where and when I grew up. I watch my oldest drink in childhood, and I wonder how it will happen for her. She is losing teeth. As the new ones thrust up from inside her watermelon pink gums, I realize I do not know how to lead her through the extinguishing light of childhood. For me, it happened all at once. but I swear I would hollow myself around her as a shield to shade her one more moment so that she may drink her fill. So this one is going back to Animal Nocturne, and I always try and kind of read this one, especially in public readings, so that everyone knows I don't only write sad poems. This is my attempt to be funny, and it's called Love as a Chicken. Sometimes I envy those couples who are mistaken for siblings, but I've found now, love, that if their love is the backyard hen, then ours is the extraordinary mille fleur Belgian barbou, her rust colored body adorned with the confused faces of epoxied African violets. Our love defies her evolutionary improbability with crested ludicrousness. Although she may startle those expecting the ordinary chicken, once she struts a few steps, they relent, acknowledging her innate pulchritude. After some quick staccato bobs of her head, they forget they saw anything at all peculiar, and she can and does return to her scratch work. I'm going to dip back into Museum of Things for a second. And this one kind of begins with a story tied to Easter, which obviously is coming up. So I thought it would be a good one to read tonight. And in this case, the artist of this particular artwork is Hasbro Inc. And the title of the poem is Truly, Truly, Truly Outrageous. It's 3 stickers from the Diamond Gem Sticker Collectors album, numbers 89, 138, and 191, depicting stills from the animated television series. 4th generation Foster collection. My mother places them inside plastic eggs for my little girls, but before they can peel them from their sticky backs, I confiscate them. These are not precious, just colored ink on paper old enough to contain something dangerous as lead. But it is the story I am after, the proof he loved me. With my girls and the eggs, when my mother tells me for the first time how my grandfather, her father, who sent her possessions COD on the day of her marriage to mine, her father, who did not know my dad when he called to say my mother had had a baby, me, sent these stickers to me for years after learning how I sometimes watched the show. I imagine I was many years past enjoying the syrupy storylines of a girl who was secretly a rock star, courtesy of her dead father who'd programmed a computer to transform anytime she wanted with the touch of a magic earring. Did he wish to transform me, transform us? Were these stickers apology for having passed judgment on my existence before I even knew it? Or were these the efforts of a former philatelist who wished to pass along something of his loss to me after his younger son stole his stamps to feed a habit? I wish to forgive the way he drove his golden child, his daughter, to the opposite coast as she tried to move out of the shadow Bob Foster cast from space. He who could have built a magic rock star generating computer with spare parts, a clean room, government funding, and enough time. I want to think the stickers letterless missives mailed to a granddaughter who sought to understand too late in life. Now the man I choose to share my life with is most like him, and we have daughters. Most days I wish they could have met. If my grandfather were to love him and he loves me, it might at last be a balanced equation. So this one is actually begins with an epigraph from Sharon Chang, who is not related to me in any way. But there are a lot of us Changs out there, right? But there was an article that she wrote for something called the Hyphen blog. And she was speaking with her 4-year-old multiracial Asian son. And this is part of their conversation. He said, "Mom, am I white?" When I told him no, he immediately followed up with, "Am I black?" When I told him he wasn't, he started crying and told me, "But I want a color too." And so this poem is called Baby's First Colors. Baby, what you are is every color. The best parts of your yellow white mama, and her white is really blue and red and green and red and white and red and just red, but we can all agree that that makes white, and your orange green plaid daddy. When others ask you what color you are, you may say plaid, orange, green, yellow, white, red, 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 blue, green, white. Or you can just say you are the star of the plumeria as it yawns open to white, the arcing red ochre green of the stem. You are also the rust of the lichen on sandstone grave markers, the shade of many feet walking across the fecund earth. If your audience still isn't placated, as some will never be, you can say, "At night, I am the red moon and sky for deserving sailors. By morning, I am usually new. In February, I am moon pies. Sometimes I am the rare blue moon. Sometimes I am strange even to myself."
Hmm.
And this poem opens Animal Nocturne. It's called "A Herd of Elephants is Sometimes Called a Memory." And unsurprisingly, there are a bunch of poems kind of about animals. The Love is a Chicken poem is in that collection as well. But this one begins with a dedication for A, who once alleged I remember too much of him. If our knowing of each other were an earthly thing, it would be dappled elephant hide, ancient pachyderm skin stretched taut across mud-cured footpads to receive tiny seismic seizures like tender pen taps, calls to rejoin the herd so low they rumble unheard past any human. I know that your marriage is dying. I wish to have language strong enough to carve away the sorrow, to mourn together and so low that only we can hear it. And this is the one that I think we were referencing earlier, kind of about my daughter and her experience of her multiracial Asian identity. And it comes from Museum of Things, and it was also published in Exit 7, which the editors nominated for a push cart. It's called On Jolly Holiday, and in this case, the artist is anonymous. But the object is a pink parasol style 100% nylon umbrella with ruffles, one painted unicorn, and four Elizabeths in gray curling script, hooked plastic handle, steel shaft and ribs, second generation Chang family collection. While traveling, my father's heart softened to the call of an elderly street vendor, Asian and stooped, quiet until he saw us moving toward him on the sidewalk. Until that moment, I'd been young enough to scramble under my mother's wing, sheltered by her shared teal umbrella. Now choosing my own feels so grown up. The man plucks it silently from his wire cart and pushes it open, twirling its petals round and round. I remember the shape of his gnarled hand, finger reaching outward like a slack mouth, as he personalized it with marker pen, replicating the exact flourish of Z and H each time he reached a new panel. I stood there long enough to be embarrassed, while he finished the job with red hearts to hide one tiny smudge, for which he mimed apology, all of it an elaborate choreograph for my benefit. When at last I pushed it open and it stuck, I hoped the world under my feet would shift like Mary Poppins' chalk-drawn world, and I would be transported into a dream where, instead of the clumsy waiter penguin I'd played in the camp show, when four younger penguins berated me for not remembering the dance, pulling tears from my eyes that surprised even me, I could emerge as beautiful Jane Banks, with her coiffed hair and rosy cheeks, her broad blue eyes. I never stopped imagining myself reborn. When my first daughter came, she surprised us all by shedding her dark hair tufts in her 4th month. Her hair grew back in blonde. I see her rosy cheeked and round as young Miss Banks, and I was foolish enough to believe that this world might be easier on her. I watch her rummage that pink umbrella from my parents' house, stroll under it in the Sunday sun with it as a shield. One day after dance class, she cries that the other girls won't be friends with her because of her skin. I want to scream and slash the air, but instead I say that her skin marks her as part of our family, that one day those girls will envy her perfect tan. I am not sure she accepts this explanation, but we both put down the weight of it and walk into the chalk-lined sunset. So these next few are the ones that I was referencing from my forthcoming project. And I'm very fortunate that this next poem is going to be in Schuylkill Valley Journal this summer. And it's called Personal Effects Not Accounted For in 1912 or 2013. And it begins with a little epigraph. Each Irish clan has a traditional knit Aran pattern for their fishermen sweaters intended to help identify bodies of family members lost at sea. And it also has a dedication for Thomas Kilgannon, 1890 to 1912, and my friend Patrick Kilgannon, 1968 to 2013. Sometimes in death we crave anonymity. Sometimes it is handed to us in disaster. That night when everything went pearl-wise, Your great 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 Uncle Thomas passed his Aran sweater to a woman friend as she receded from the deck of the doomed ship, slipped to onto Needle, lowering 6 stories down, away from grinning death. Was he thinking of the chill, or fearful that the wet wool's heft knit to around his body should he slip into the glassy drink, the ocean's grasp for him he must have sensed, clawing upward to pull him off the cabling needle, skip to, continue to work. I imagine the air frozen with heavy silence, knit to, slip to, but survivors describe a seascape burning, panic hot, with heavy and appeals from the dying. Turn pearlwise. Sometimes in death we crave disaster, but it hands us anonymity instead. Patrick, you died in the car. You knew to steer to the side of the road, feeling something falter in your chest. Your ship's clock stopped. Rudderless, mute death overtook you. Knit to, slip to. What haunts me is the pleas I still hear, desperate cries channeling your love's panic when you failed to arrive. Repeat to the end of the row. Did the officer know how much you were cherished when he found you alone? Turn pearlwise. Thomas never made it back either. His third-class ticket invisibly stamped, unworthy of rescue or recovery. Knit to, slip to. He must have known he was handing away his birthright, all hope of ever being called his own name by the ocean in her clear, deep voice. And this one is again part of the Titanic project, and it references one of the survivors of that tragedy, who was actually again a man named Fang Lang, whose story inspired James Cameron in that final scene of his movie. The story is that Fang Lang survived by first strapping himself to a body in the ocean and secondly jumping onto a door. And so this is called Lifeboat 14. And the epigraph says the number 14 is considered one of the unluckiest in Chinese numerology because 1 stands for guaranteed and 4 is nearly a homophone for the word death. He was supposed to die on the ship. He knew this the moment he stepped into the freezing North Atlantic and felt the water's ice-crusted fingers reach inside his cotton robe. But let's imagine the water changed him. The ice slapped a centaur into being, and the beast end of this chimera was the corpse he found to bind himself to, winding his wide belt around them both like an equator. Did he think this bulk might have once been first class and moneyed, might have died with a belly full of oyster and filet mignon? Fang Lang's steed could have been history's darling, an Astor or my great-grandfather, bobbing in the new dark. Even the bulk of a dead man losing body heat by the second must have felt like comfort, an embrace from the beyond. If he was supposed to die on the ship, what did he think when he spotted that mocking splinter of sumptuous ship floating by? Maybe it was from the bathhouse he never saw, certain doors always closed to him and the other passengers from the alien passenger list. Floating free from the body he'd wound around, Lang latched on, steadied himself on the carved doorframe. Out of the water, every inch of him must have seized from shivering in the biting air. Did he sleep at all that night or early morning, spent from struggling atop this wooden layer cake? Maybe he'd felt it in his bones he would not die on the ship, and then in the water, and again on the door. But when he saw Lifeboat 14 closing the distance toward him, heard the voices calling out urgently for survivors, didn't he wonder if it might be death, reaching out with one final offer? And this is a translation from Claude de Berquin. And again, it kind of hits on many of the themes that you hear in my work. So I thought it was appropriate to read as we were wounding down tonight. It's called We Die. We die from childhood, from our wainscoting, from our strong-muscled trees, from our land that stirs under the footfalls of the seasons, more surely still than from love. But we die from a love that comes in the dark of night, when evening has embroidered his cloak with messenger stars, and his hands are covered with the soft leather of meetings, so his words open the room where they seem to be sleeping, the ones who wait for us. And I will close with the same poem that closes the Museum of Things collection. And it is again an assemblage. So it's two objects, and it's called The Moon and the Sun. And one of the objects is a book. It's called The Weaving of a Dream, a retold Chinese fairy tale. And it's a children's book, a puffin classic by Marilee Hayer, second generation Chang family collection. And the other object, the artist is Michael Chang, who was born in 1952. And the description is a white plastic globe around LED bulb with black base from old lamppost, balanced on hollowed out wooden bowl, electronics with a corded switch. And it's the second generation Chang family collection. My father read to me from his passed down library of golden books, books for little American children. And I learned that stories weren't about people who looked like us. I felt my Asianness a secret, one that the authors did not know or understand. But once I found the weaving of a dream tucked in among the many golden spines, a retold Chinese fairy tale of three sons, no daughters, about a parent who asks the impossible after falling in love with art, the wind snatching away her happiness. Of course, it is the youngest son who stays the longest, remains loyal and courageous. My father is the youngest, and when his mother faltered, he did not hesitate to knock out his front teeth, swallow his cries as he flew over fire, stifle screams as he lulled in a vast sea of grief. Reading this book, I remember tracing the confident curl of the hand drawn cat with the pad of my fingers as it rested at the mother's bedside, how its back intertwined in my mind with the line about the parent who loves the one perfect child best. And though this story does not mention the cat, I knew this to be true. At the end of his journey, the youngest son at last traces his mother's weaving to a palace of fairies and monsters. At night, the most beautiful fairy hangs a pearl to work by as a lamp. It is elemental as the moon, this love of art and beauty. When the old street lamp snuffed out outside my childhood home, my father brought me with him to help him choose a new one. The one I liked did not match the style of our modest home, but it shone like the moon beyond our door. Every night I imagined I could see the curve of a fairy's cupped hands in the soft brown dark that enfolded it. Before we sold that house, my father took down the globe, replaced it. He fashioned a lamp base from a bottomless bowl, rewired the moon so it would not glow too hot, gifted it to me many years later so I can read to my daughters at night by its light. He never says, we share these things, a history. He does not say, you are mine.
Wow. I wanted we still have more time if you wanted to read one more poem, but where did you find Claude de Burin?
Oh, yeah.
Uh, and how did that fascinate you? Because I mean, your translations are great, and those poems are lovely,
But
lovely poems.
thank you. I fell in love, well, with French in high school. And when I was in my graduate program, I was really interested in kind of taking taking a trip into the world of translation. And so I was fortunate enough to work with Jody Gladding, who is spectacular, and kind of seeing some of the tiny little details of what can happen, especially when we're talking about the details of Claude de Burin, right? Um, and kind of how amazing she is, right, in the first place, and all the details that kind of surround it. But she herself is not super famous, at least in the U.S. She is more famous in France itself, and so. And in a lot of ways, I would say I was drawn to her because she's kind of mysterious. And I guess maybe I always go for the difficult, the challenges, right?
Mhm.
She was collected in an anthology of female French poets, and she was asked to contribute a photograph of herself, and she stoutly refused, and instead drew a picture of herself that basically doesn't resemble a person at all. But it was an attempt, I think, to kind of show her inner self, right? Show what
Mhm.
she felt was significant about herself, which is
Mhm.
again something that I've always been really drawn to. Whether or not I think I could pull it off is a whole different story.
Right. It's we have we have time. Could you read one of your favorite, you know, one of her favorite poems? Because there's so many. There, and this is in the What Ordinary Objects. And could you read one of her poems
One of
for us? I just thought
hers.
that I thought your selection and your collection of the poems that you translated were
Yeah.
absolutely wonderful, and it really drew me. I want to, know more about her work, and
Oh,
even
well, I'm glad that I can help.
yeah, yeah.
It is always quite the honor to hear her words kind of coming through me and coming out my mouth. Um, but I will do this one, which is the one that somehow the people, the friends of Shakespeare and Company, found this, I guess, on the internet. And they reached out to me, which was quite exciting. And so this is the translated title is "It is late." It is late. Cold comes quickly. The paths fold in on themselves. Autumn hasn't given the order yet, but the light fades. Pewter will take back its thoughts, copper its long travels, the chestnut its destiny as a spiny, displaced urchin. The furniture waits. The windows, the doors close themselves, wary. How to find you again if there aren't any roses, any roads to follow, barefoot? To speak to you by a canal that will be icy soon? Under the brown light of Parisian bistros where beer is captain of the ship? We had the leaves before, the flowers, the silences, but your hand is not offered, and the light goes out of everything, like a gold bracelet found in the park. The night watchman begins his rounds.
Oh, that is gorgeous.
Thank you.
Um, so thank you so much, Liz. This has really been great. I mean, your reading of your poems was, was really remarkable and wonderful. It's just great to hear somebody read their poetry really, really well. So, very thankful on behalf of Moonstone and Philly Loves Poetry to finally have you on and for you to read and discuss your poetry, and wish you good luck in moving
Thank
forward. And we want you to stay in touch. So when your next collection comes out, that we know about it and we're here. I mean, we're in our seventh season. And so keep us in mind,
you.
when something happens so that we can keep in touch with you and we can let our audience know about that. So, and thank you very much to Aaron Phelan, who is our technical director and makes this really happen flawlessly, every time. And to Philly Cam, for being our, kind of co-host for this series. And it's really been a remarkable experience. And this year, it's really, really, really been special. I mean, you as well as the other poets that I've had on have just been glorious. And I mentioned Moonstone, of course, and you know, I keep talking about this about Moonstone Arts. Moonstone Arts Center does more, and I would say nationally. I can't think of any organization. Maybe there's some organization in New York that does more to promote the culture of poetry in an area like Larry does. I mean, not only do we have these readings, about 105 a year, which give a platform to close to 325 poets, many of them local, but some of them from all over the world. And then all of this publication that Larry's doing, as well as these anthologies that he publishes that are topical, that answer and respond to the different things that we are facing as a society, some of which we had talked about tonight. So I just ask people, that you can help us, you can help Moonstone Arts, but it's going to our site and making a donation to keep that alive for all that Larry does. I call him a cultural treasure of Philadelphia, which he is, and Moonstone is a cultural treasure. And so next month, I'm going to have a young poet who I had in the live studio when she was 12 years old, and now she's 17, I think, going on 18. I just received a copy of her book, When You Want It Blue, which is published by Moonstone also. Her name is Matilda Bray. So I'm very much looking forward to that. and talking about what her next moves are in her in her art and her poetry. I met up with her at Larry's 80th birthday celebration, and I mean she's all grown up, as they say. And I did hear her read some of her poems, and they were just glorious. So once again, thank you for everyone for viewing. I think it's been a real treat tonight as in having Liz Chang as our special guest, and her poems were really great. And the discussion of her work and how she goes about it was also really great to hear. So thank you very much, and I will see you. I will see you next month.